All right, so welcome everybody. Good morning. I'm just going to ask the speakers to be going off. And if I can ask everybody to take their cameras off, and then we can actually start our session today. So everybody, please take your cameras off, except for our speaker. So welcome everybody again. We'll start with just a quick introduction to. You're gonna have to go into the other room. Sorry about that. So we've got on the other side of the world, everybody. We're gonna have to welcome Emeritus Professor Stephen Krashen, Stephen D. Krashen. I'll just read you something from his from the Wikipedia. What Wikipedia has to say, that Stephen D. Krashen is a Professor Emeritus at the University of Southern California. He moved from the Linguistics Department to the Faculty of the School of Education in 1994. He is a linguist, educational researcher, and, as I just realized very recently, a political activist, a very committed political activist. But we're not going to be talking about that today, Stephen. Stephen D. Krashen received a PhD in linguistics from the University of California, Los Angeles. He has amongst papers and books more than 486 publications. Now, contributing to the fields of second language acquisition, bilingual education, and reading. We are very fortunate to have him here, and I have to first of all say thank you again to Stephen Krashen. I know that a lot of you will share this. Those of you who have studied languages, learning acquisition, teaching, anything to do with languages, learning, teaching, acquisition, you would have come across Stephen Krashen's name. Now that's not just here in Australia, we're talking abroad, all over the world. So we're very, very fortunate. I'm going to make Stephen Krashen our host in just a moment and hand him over to you. So Stephen, over to you and welcome everybody.
Okay, thank you, Alex. Let me tell you what Alex, the introduction, you got it all wrong. I'm sorry.
There you go,
Not 480, 555.
Oh, that's
Come
Wikipedia.
On, give me a break. You think I've been sitting around doing nothing? I mean, that must have been 2 months old, okay?
That's right.
I've been doing great being home.
Well done.
Wow, it's been wonderful. Being home, being isolated by this, the coronavirus is really serious, but I'm stuck at home with my girlfriend, which is great. We've only been married 54 years, and I'm getting so much work done. These webinars are fun to do. Anyway, what I want to do today, I have 3 goals. Number 1, I want to make your teaching lives, your professional lives, easier. Number 2, I want to save you some money. And number 3, I'm going to have some advice on improving your social life, but that's going to come later, okay? Let me first go over the last, 45 years, 50 years of research. I'll summarize them in just a few minutes, and it won't be that difficult. Our work begins with a crucial distinction. There are 2 ways you can get better in another language. You can acquire language, you can learn language, and they're very different. Acquisition, we sometimes call the natural way, and a synonym for acquisition is picking up a language. I was in Europe for a few weeks and I picked up some French. It really means you acquired it. It happens subconsciously. While you're acquiring, you don't know you're acquiring. You think you're doing something else.
I need some more sound.
You think you're having a conversation, reading a book. Am I coming through okay? Should I talk louder? Okay. You think you're having a conversation, reading a book, but at the same time, you might be acquiring. Also, when you're finished acquiring, you don't always know that anything has happened. The knowledge is represented subconsciously in your mind. So while it's happening, you don't know it's happening. We also know that the ability to subconsciously pick up languages is with us our entire lives. It never goes away. Children acquire first language. Children can acquire second language. Teenagers can acquire. Grown-ups can acquire. Old people can acquire. The ability to pick up languages does not disappear at puberty. It's with us forever. Let me give you a couple examples of this. I'm still working on languages. I'm 79. I know I look much, much younger, maybe 76, but I'm still working on it, and it's going very, very well. I've got this buddy, this friend of mine, Steve Kaufman. You may have heard of him. He's a famous polyglot. Steve now speaks 20 languages. No kidding. I have been with him. I have watched him do it with different languages, different situations. He's the real thing. Of his 20 languages, he has acquired 8 of them since age 62. Now, that is inspirational. Well, that's acquisition. The other process is learning. Learning is what we did in school, knowing about language, knowing the rules. The subject and the verb are supposed to agree. In phonics, when 2 vowels go walking, the first does the talking. So in everyday language, when we talk about rules, we talk about grammar, we're talking about learning. Error correction helps learning. You make a mistake, someone corrects you, you're supposed to change your idea of what the rule is. The brain is very good at acquisition. The brain is not very good at conscious learning. That explains a lot of the frustration we have. Let me go up to the 1970s and early 1980s and tell you what we were doing then. We were working on a hypothesis which has really paid off for us, called the natural order hypothesis. It says we acquire, not learn, but acquire language in a predictable order. Some things come early, some things come in the middle, some things come late. For example, in English as a first language, the ing marker, John is playing the violin, that's one of the first grammatical markers to come in. The third person singular, I go, you go, he goes, that's very late. In first language, there might be 6 months to a year between the ing and the third person singular. In some grown-ups, the ing might never come. We all know people who speak English as a second language very well, who sometimes mess up on the third person singular. Here's some amazing things about the natural order idea. You can't change it. There's nothing you can do about it. You can drill the third person singular all day long, but just like good wine, it won't come until its time is ready, until it's ready. You can't change it. There's nothing you can do about it. I want to tell you about my buddy back at USC. When I was a professor in the 70s, the office across the hall from me was, in the office was a syntax specialist, a grammar specialist. His name was Matt Shibatani, Masayoshi Shibatani. He had studied at MIT with Chomsky, and boy, did he know grammar. He knew everything. I always went to him when I had problems with grammar. I needed to know something. He had the answer in Japanese and in English. When he wrote, his English was perfect, no problem. In casual conversation, Matt would sometimes drop the third person singular. Now, Matt knew more about grammar than anyone in California. He knew that rule when he was 8 years old. He had studied it in school. He was a specialist in grammar. He would still blow that rule every so often. Knowing the rule consciously does not help you acquire it. There are different systems. I think that's remarkable. Okay, you can't change it. Study doesn't help. Another interesting phenomena. The order is not from simple to complicated. Some things that are early acquired are pretty complicated, like the ing marker. Some things that are late acquired are simple. Third singular, you think anyone who could tie their shoes could get it right. Turns out, no, it's late acquired. Now, in 1981, if you were in Los Angeles at the time and you went to the TESOL convention, you probably went to my speech. There was standing room, crowd only. There were only 10 chairs and 12 people showed up. And I made a statement which I now think is dead wrong. I said then, we have the natural order. Let's just teach along the natural order. The progressive marker ing is early, we'll teach that early. The third person singular is late. We'll teach that. We'll do that late. I now think that was absolutely incorrect. Chomsky has said there's nothing wrong with being wrong. And that was one case when I was absolutely dead wrong. The natural order is the result of language acquisition. There is no teaching order. Give people lots of input. We'll talk about that later. Give them what they need. And the result will be acquisition along the order. Let's not worry about it. My next hypothesis tells us about grammar and what the role is of grammar teaching and conscious learning. I'm often accused of being anti-grammar. Don't ever teach grammar. Krashen says, don't teach grammar. Teach grammar, go to jail. No, I would never say that. My position on grammar is this. It's not forbidden. It's not illegal. It's not terrible. It's very hard to do. It's very hard to use consciously learned knowledge when we're speaking another language. There are several constraints on actually using grammar. And a good way of get the feeling for this, think about a language that you can speak a little bit of, but you're not real good. A language where you're kind of a low intermediate. Part of my research is working on languages all the time. Some I do very well, some I'm kind of in the middle, some I'm terrible. And that really gives you an insight that you can't get anywhere else. My intermediate knowledge, my intermediate language now is Spanish. I'm gradually moving to the more advanced stages. I'm doing a lot of reading and stuff. But when I speak Spanish, here's what happens. First, the sentence pops into my brain. Then I scan it in my mind's eye and I look for mistakes. I think of the rules I know and I make corrections and I apply the corrections before I speak. This is what we do when we use grammar when we're speaking. It's not a very good method. It will run you into trouble and you come out speaking very slowly and awkwardly. If you want to apply rules while you're using another language, 3 conditions have to be met, and they're very hard to meet. Number 1, you got to know the rule. Even the greatest linguists in the world don't know all the rules. You ask Noam Chomsky, how many rules do you know of English? And he knows more than anybody else, no question. He's been studying this for 70 years. He'll say, we've only described fragments. There's a lot about English that we haven't described. Let's say then you go to people who write grammar books. They don't know as many rules as Chomsky does, but they know a lot of them. They don't know all the rules. Then you go to language teachers who are dedicated grammar teachers. They don't know all the rules that are in the books. Our most able grammar teachers don't teach all the rules they know. Our best students don't understand all the rules that are presented to them, and they don't remember the rules. So we're dealing with, if we're thinking about conscious knowledge and knowing the rules, it's a very, very small number of rules right away. That's a big constraint on grammar. If you want to use grammar when you're speaking, you've got to be thinking about grammar. You've got to be focused on correctness. We call it focused on form. Very unnatural. It's kind of like rubbing your tummy and patting your head at the same time. We're not really made to do this. And it makes your speech quite awkward. So that's hard to do, very hard to do. Number 3, if you want to apply grammar rules while you're speaking, you got to have enough time. It takes time to retrieve the rules, think of where it goes, put it in the sentence. People slow down a lot when they're thinking about grammar. So it's tough to do. Our research back in the late 70s and early 80s confirmed this, that in most situations, when communication is at stake, people don't use very much grammar, hardly any at all. The only time when you can get people to really use lots of conscious knowledge of grammar, and our studies support this, is when you give them a grammar test. When you give them a grammar test, all these conditions are met. They've studied the rule, they're thinking about the rules, correctness, and they have time. That's when we see people using grammar. And even then, it's not very impressive. So my feeling on grammar, it's very, very hard to use, extremely difficult. It's okay in some cases, like when you have to edit your writing, even native speakers of English, there are rules that well-read native speakers of English have not acquired that are considered important. Like, is there an apostrophe in I in its and its? What's the difference? I have to look that up about once a week. I keep forgetting. Okay, that's the use of grammar. Now we come to the big one. How is language acquired? Let me introduce this by giving you two very quick language lessons, and you'll tell me which one you like better. I'll use a language that some of you may have studied, but probably most of you haven't, and you can tell me which of these two lessons is better. Here's lesson number 1. Wir werden jetzt anfangen, Deutsch zu lernen. Und ich möchte Ihnen voraussagen, dass nach meiner Meinung Deutsch ist eine sehr schöne Sprache und ich hoffe, dass Sie alle sehr viel Erfolg mit Deutsch haben werden. What do you think? Good lesson? If I kept talking to you like that, would you pick up German? No. How about if I repeated it? Would that help? No. How about if I said it louder? How about if I said it, you repeated it back? How about if I wrote it on the board and you copied it down? How about if I wrote it a sentence on the board, I erased every fourth word and you guess what the word is? None of those things matter, and you can see that now. Here's lesson number 2. Das ist meine Hand. Verstehen Sie das? Hand? Ja, gut. Und das ist auch meine Hand. Ich habe zwei Hände. Hier sind meine Ohren. Ich habe 2 Ohren. 1, 2. Und hier ist mein Mund. Und hier sind meine Zigaretten. Ja, meine Zigaretten. Ich habe keine Zigaretten. Zigaretten sind nicht gut. If you understood lesson number 2, not every word, but more or less, I did everything necessary to teach you German. We acquire language in one way and only one way. Here it is, when we understand it. When we understand what people are saying, or when we understand what we read. Not how they're saying it, but what they're saying. We call this comprehensible input. Comprehensible input is the only game in town. We don't acquire language by speaking. We don't acquire language by writing. We don't acquire language by getting our errors corrected. We don't acquire language by learning grammatical rules. It's only by listening and reading when we understand what we hear and we understand what we read. Let me share with you two amazing facts, just two today, about language acquisition using comprehensible input. Number 1, no work. It's effortless. Language acquisition does not require grim determination, hard study. It requires understanding what people tell you and understanding what you read. It's also, I love this one, involuntary. Like it or not, you all just acquired a little German. There's nothing you can do about it. It's over. Language acquisition is easy. We are made to acquire language. Now, given comprehensible input, in other words, you have to acquire. You have no choice. You can't turn off the language acquisition device. You can't turn off your liver. Same idea, okay, just by thinking about it. Given comprehensible input, it's got to happen, not through hard work. Leonard Newmark is a linguistics researcher, University of San Diego. His theory is quite similar to mine. He came before me, in fact, and I'm dependent on his work. And he made this point. He said, if it's true that we acquire by input, in order to acquire language, you have to pay attention to the input. How about that? And there's an easy way of doing it. Make sure the input is interesting. And I'm going to push this a little farther. I'm going to say the best input, what Benico Mason would call optimal input, is not just interesting, it's extremely interesting. It's compelling. That means so interesting that you forget that you're listening to or reading another language. That's how it works. It's got to be. Now, I turn the page. All right. There we go. It's got to be compelling. The best kind of input is so exciting, so interesting, you're no longer aware that it's another language. The best way of making sure input is comprehensible, tell people things that they'll be interested in, and the best way to do that is stories. I want to give you one example of this and then go into how we can apply this stuff. This is the case history that I learned about from one of my students, from Christy Lau, who's a former student of mine who now lives in the San Francisco area. Her son, who's now all grown up and going off to graduate school, her son grew up in their household, her and her husband. They were both from Hong Kong. Their first language was Cantonese. So he grew up with both English and Cantonese and grew up comfortably bilingual in both. When he was a little boy, Mommy and Daddy were working hard. Christy was a new professor at San Francisco State University, and her husband had a job in the Silicon Valley in the technology industry. And occasionally they had to hire a babysitter. Babysitter would come over, turn on the television to Mandarin cartoons. Now, you know, and I know, but most people don't know, that Mandarin and Cantonese are really different languages. If you know one, it doesn't mean the other is automatically comprehensible. It doesn't mean you can speak the other. There is some similarity. They're related, kind of like Spanish and Romanian, both Romantic languages. So it does give you a kind of help. It's a head start. The babysitter would come over, turn on the TV to these wonderful cartoons. I'm a big fan of children's television. I think it's genius. SpongeBob, what could be better than SpongeBob? My goodness. Anyway, she would turn on the TV to Mandarin cartoons. Thanks to the interesting stories, the wonderful visuals, the bit of shared vocabulary with Cantonese and Mandarin, and the help of a kind caretaker, this boy started to understand some of the cartoons. He'd watch the same ones again and again, and gradually as time went on, they got more and more comprehensible. When he went to elementary school, he started watching children's TV in Mandarin, which is very prevalent in his area, and gradually understood more. When he was in high school, Dad would bring home 2 movies every weekend in Mandarin. The family would watch them together. And in the evening, the whole family, mom, dad, children, grandma, grandpa, would watch the news in Mandarin. Today, this young man speaks Mandarin. They have company come over who are Mandarin speakers. He does fine. They have visited Taiwan, Beijing, Mandarin speaking areas. No problem. He gets along very, very well. Here's the major point. His name, we call him Paul in the research. Paul was never motivated to acquire Mandarin. He was quite happy knowing English and Cantonese. He didn't try to learn Mandarin. There's a great deal of pressure in China from the Chinese cultural agency Hanban that all people of Chinese origin, Chinese genetics should know Mandarin. It's the common language we have among us. He didn't care. He liked the stories. He liked the cartoons. He liked the TV programs. He was never motivated to acquire Mandarin. He was motivated to understand the cartoons. This has changed my whole view of motivation. You have a class, let's say middle school kids, English is a second language. They don't want to be there. They want to be out skateboarding and being with their pals. You tell them a good story in English that's compelling, that's exciting. They will acquire English whether they're motivated to or not. It's the comprehensible, compelling input that really works. The conclusion I've come to, you got to be having a good time. In my case, I've been practicing this stuff on myself. I've been reading in other languages, and I make sure what I'm reading is really interesting. If after a few pages the story is not what I want, I don't bother going on. I have the power of putting the book down, etc. It really works. Another important point before we go on to application. Language acquisition doesn't happen all at once. It's a gradual process. This is wonderful research by Richard Anderson and his research team from the University of Illinois. The first studies were done with English as a second language. English as a first language in this case. We've replicated it with second language. They find that each time you see a word in print that's unfamiliar and the context gives you some clues to the meaning, you get a little bit of it. You don't get the whole thing all at once. And gradually, as you see it again and again, you gradually build up the whole meaning. And this all happens subconsciously. They estimate that each time you see a new word in print, this is a rough average, you get about 5% of the meaning. So you need about 20 repetitions in different interesting contexts for the word to really be acquired firmly. This means our students need to see a lot of input. It needs to be what Dr. Mason calls abundant input, a great deal. Now, the people who criticize this say context is not very helpful. Context can lead you in the wrong direction. A lot of context is vague and misdirected. Favorite example, you have a picture of a man pointing. Now, and there's a word underneath it that you don't know the meaning of. Does it mean finger? Does it mean hand? Does it mean pointing? Well, you don't know. You're getting just a piece of the meaning. It could be one of these, something like that. If you see it again and again, though, most contexts are helpful, and they gradually help you narrow down the meaning. So the conclusions from all this, we want input to have several characteristics. Benico Mason calls this optimal input. It has to be comprehensible. It has to be, best input has to be compelling, really interesting. There needs to be a lot of it. And it needs to be what we call rich. That means lots of new words that you don't know or new grammar with a context that helps make it comprehensible. Well, with that in mind, let's move on to application. And I'm going to introduce new terminology. I told you I'd give you all this help and I'd help you financially. This is part of it. How would you like to be a famous lecturer and an expert like me and travel around and give lectures in Australia? And Monday, I'm speaking in Dubai on computer, Japan. I speak all over the world. Here's the secret. Invent new terminology, but don't quite tell people what it means. Make it a little bit vague so they think you're a lot smarter than they are. And that's what I've been doing my whole life. All these things that people don't quite understand, comprehensible input, I+1, if you've read my stuff, it really works. Let me tell you, I've got new terminology today, and it won't be clear at the beginning, which means this is a good one. I call it the Conduit Hypothesis. Now, you don't have the slightest idea what I'm talking about, and that's the point. That makes me sound very impressive, but it really is a simple idea. The Conduit Hypothesis says, in language acquisition, first and second, children and adults, there are 3 universal stages we go through. Each stage is a conduit to the next one. Each stage helps you move to the next one. It's background and prerequisite to the next one. The first stage, stories. We all go through it with optimal first language acquisition. I'll tell you what happened to me, and I am an interesting case. I would like to tell you how I suffered and worked hard and achieved great eminence despite the odds against me, but none of that is true. I really had it easy. I grew up in a middle-class family with wonderful parents, my goodness, who loved each other and loved me and my sister and really just gave us everything we needed. My sister was part of this group. I'll probably talk to her tomorrow. She was 4 years older than I, 3.5 years, and She's always thought she's my assistant mother, you know how older sisters are. She was always doing things for me, never asked for anything. When I was 9 years old, she took me to the local library and got me a library card. It was that kind of stuff all the time. She got me involved in stories. Mom and Dad told me stories all the time. My sister Gloria got me involved in radio stories. There were stories everywhere, and they were interesting and comprehensible, and people around me who helped make them comprehensible. This is what the research says. Children who hear more stories in school or out of school do better in school. They really can't miss. Stories give you language and give you knowledge, no question. Our work in second language pedagogy, second language teaching, the foundation is stories. Most newer methods today, the beginning level is stories, stories that kids like. I'm going to report today on the work of Beniko Mason and what she calls story listening. You could find her website fairly easily and you'll see what she's done. For English as a second language, and she's fine-tuned this in Japan, she presents to beginning students, low intermediate students, she presents stories of universal interest. She loves Grimm fairy tales because she says these are stories that have stood the test of time. And you can always find good ones, and a lot of them are available for free on the web, etc. The copyright is worn off, etc. She makes the story comprehensible by using context. She'll prepare a story. She's going to tell a story to the class. She figures out which words and which grammatical structures might give the students some problems, and she prepares for it. So she's ready. She calls this list a prompter. She comes to a new word. You know, there were two men on the street. Okay, she'll draw a picture of a man. She'll draw and a street, etc. Then she'll explain it again. And gradually it becomes comprehensible. She'll also include it in the story. It'll come back using drawings, gestures, and if necessary, an occasional translation if she happens to know the language of the children, the language of the students. We have very good evidence that this works. What she does not do is emphasize the new vocabulary so the students will study it. She doesn't tell them, write the word down and make flashcards, none of that. What we have found with our studies is that the time spent listening to stories results in more vocabulary acquisition than time spent on vocabulary drills. Her conclusion: don't tell a story and then give them drills on the vocabulary. Instead, tell another story. The words are going to come back. The common ones always do. Over the long run, it's far more efficient and much more fun. Far more efficient. Well, that's stage one, and it could go on for quite a while. Kids can hear 100 or more stories, and that they make very, very good progress. They then move to reading. It's the Conduit Hypothesis. Stories are the conduit to reading. Let me give you some of the evidence on reading in general, and then I'll go back to her pedagogical approach. My conclusion has been that self-selected, free voluntary reading of stories is the most important weapon we have for developing language. In other words, fiction. Fiction has had a bad reputation in language teaching, thanks to the United States, the Common Core. You know, fiction is just stories. Turns out fiction is amazing. The more fiction you read, the better off you are in everything. I'll give you just two studies on this. Study done in the UK, done in the University of London. Researchers were able to study the same people over years and years, starting as very young kids, 1 or 2 years old, giving them a series of tests, waiting a couple of years, giving them more tests, not a lot of them, just a few, and then comparing over time. The last time they did the study, the subjects were 42 years old. I don't know how old the researchers were, but the subjects were 42. And this time, they gave them a vocabulary test. These are native speakers of English. They gave them an English vocabulary test and questionnaires. The best predictor of adult vocabulary was reading, and the best kind of reading, fiction. Middlebrow and highbrow fiction was more powerful than nonfiction. Isn't that amazing? And it didn't matter how much reading they had done as a child, how much they had done as a teenager. The reading you're doing at 42 is what's really helping you. This is phenomenal, in my opinion. I'm just giving you bits and pieces. This is over and over again in the literature. One more study. This was done with second language. Again, Benico Mason's students. Dr. Mason taught a class at her university. She just retired, but still working, fortunately. She did a study in which, she, as part of her teaching load, she taught a class where people could just show up from the community and get English lessons, part of the university program. In this one study, the students, after taking her class for a semester, they listened to stories in class and they read from graded readers at home, simple books. A lot of them said, "This is very interesting. Could you hang with us and keep going with us, help us find books to read and give us advice?" And she said yes, under the condition that every so often they take a standardized test, the Toeic test, which is a big deal throughout Asia, standardized test of English, just the listening and reading part. They did it. She had about 10 students who did this. We had their Toeic scores and we had records of what they read. She asked them to write down the books that they read. Some of them did it for a few months. Some of them did it for a year and a half. So we had very good data. Here is what she found. The average student gained, we were able to estimate how much time they put in from what they read. The average student gained, for every hour of reading, they gained more than a half a point on this TOEIC exam. 0.6 the first time she did it. Her more recent analysis is even better. It's nearly 3/4 of a point. Now the TOEIC exam runs from 0 to 1,000. 250 means you're ready to start reading on your own. And you hit 5, 6, 7, 800. You're getting there. You hit 800 on this test. You've got a long way toward acquiring academic English so you can actually use English in school. If you gain even a half a point for every hour you read 1 hour a day for a year, 2 hours, even better, read 3 hours a day for a year. You can go from that low level just about all the way to the top in a year or two. This is so much more interesting and entertaining than having to go through exercise books and having to study vocabulary lists. I got this idea a long time ago, about 20 years ago. I was going over to see my dad where he was staying at the time. Mom and Dad were staying at an assisted living place. And I was waiting till it was visiting hours. And I was at my favorite restaurant, McDonald's, of course, just waiting. And next to me was a teenager at a table. And he had on his table, just staring off, a book of vocabulary exercises that he needed to do for school. Draw a line from the word to the definition, write 3 sentences with every word. He was not interested. You could tell. He just had the book next to him. If that had been a really good novel, a baseball story, a football story, anything that would get him excited, he would have been gaining vocabulary, language, etc. This is the mistake we've made. What Dr. Mason has shown, that reading will do it. Fiction is the best predictor. Most of what these kids read was fiction. So what we have learned from this is that reading will give you the language that you need for academic success. Readers have better vocabulary. They're better at spelling. Are you listening, Donald Trump? They're better at writing. They're better at everything connected to literacy, the major source, self-selected fiction. Now, I think that I'm going to stay here for a moment and talk about self-selection, because I think self-selection is key. I'm going to read you a section, little paragraph written by Garrison Keillor, an American humorist and literacy person. And he talks about getting books as gifts. When I get a book as a gift, I consider it assigned reading because the person is going to expect me to read it. And if I see the person again, they'll say, oh, did you like that book I left you? And this is what Garrison Keillor says. As a former English major in college, I'm a sitting duck for gift books. And in the past few years, I've gotten Dickens, Thackeray, Smollett, Richardson, Emerson, Keats, Boswell, and the Brontes, all of them great with a capital G. None of them ever read by me. All of them now on my shelf, looking at me and making me feel guilty. And again, I'm worried that someday one of these people is going to ask me how I like the book. If someone recommends a book to me, I am never inclined to read it. I want to read what I want to read, what I select myself. Actually, there's an exception to this. There's one person, when he makes a recommendation, I always follow it. I've learned to do that because he knows me better than I know myself. And that's my son. When he says, try this, Dad, he's always right and it always works out. But these people are very, very unusual, let me tell you. Well, reading does more than simply give you grammar and language and good writing style, which it does. It does a lot more. Reading gives you knowledge. Studies done at the University of Michigan, a guy named Keith Stanovich, done very good work. This is first language stuff. People who read more know more. They know more about literature. That's no surprise. They know more about history. They know more about social studies in general, what's going on in the world. They know more about science. They know more about practical matters. Fiction gives you that knowledge. Let me tell you about my conversations with my cousin Evelyn. I'm really crazy about Evelyn. She's been one of my favorite people my whole life. She's older than I am, and she's always been the friendly, helpful older cousin. When I was a little boy, I'd always go see her and her husband, Marty. She was a violinist. I played the piano. Eventually, we started doing music. She was always very helpful and supportive. And she was one of my mother's absolute best friends. So I'm very loyal to Evelyn. She's now 93. She was telling me the other day, my husband, Marty, may he rest in peace, went to law school. He never practiced law, but he really knew a lot about it. And we found that very helpful in getting through life, knowing about the law. She said, now that I have time, I'm going to take a class in law. And I said, Evelyn, I have another suggestion. Read novels about law. Read the works of John Grisham. You'll learn a lot about law and you'll have a good time. Evelyn has been doing that. I've been buying her novels, law novels, John Grisham especially. I'm now switching over, adding Lisa Scottolini, who's considered to be the female John Grisham. I think she's slightly better. As a matter of fact, both these authors are wonderful. Evelyn's doing that. She says, I am learning so much without really trying. I wish I had read The Runaway Jury before I did jury duty a while ago. I would have been so much more efficient and good on the jury. So it gives you knowledge. Not only that, there's some evidence emerging in the last few years that fiction reading gives you what we call desirable habits of mind. People who read fiction, studies show, have a greater capacity to empathize with others. There's good reason why. When you're reading fiction, you become the main character. You go through the same problems. You try to solve them that the main character does. You meet all the people that the main character does. You have to make these decisions with the author, etc. I finally read Murder on the Orient Express. Wonderful. So many different situations. You meet so many people that way, and you get to understand how different people are thinking. Also, reading, the research also says, makes you suspicious of simple solutions. The world is complicated, and books like Murder on the Orient Express show you how complicated it can be. I read an article published in The Guardian, as you know, British publication. They interviewed Barack Obama and they asked him what his reading habits were. Did he read fiction? And his answer was as if he had just read all this research. He says, yes, I like reading fiction, and I'll tell you why. Fiction tells me that people who seem very different from the way I am, if you get to know them, you find similarities and you can get to understand them better. And he also said just exactly what the research says. Reading tells me that the world is complicated. Simple, simplistic solutions don't work. So look what we get from reading. We get language, we get knowledge, and these profitable habits of mind. Now, I am a student of past history, American history, and I'm very impressed with American President Theodore Roosevelt, who said, it is the duty of the citizen to criticize the president. This is a patriotic thing. If you fail to criticize the president when the president deserves criticism, you are not meeting your obligations. With this in mind, I'll tell you a little of what I've been trying to do with our current president, who I regard as one of the most dangerous people in history. The Washington Post had a series of articles about Trump and his tweeting. He likes to stay up all night and tweet after tweet after tweet, and he makes spelling mistakes. And some people criticized him in letters, he should get a spell check. And other people said, it's not a big deal, it's only spelling. If you just checked it, you got someone to proofread it, it would be fine. Take it easy, you're picking on him, it's unfair. I wrote a letter. I said, spelling is serious. Our research shows that spelling comes from reading. Good readers are much better spellers than poor reading. Reading is the source of much of our spelling knowledge. Reading will not make you a perfect speller, but you're much better off than someone who doesn't read at all. When I use the spell check, which is frequent, they give you a list of 4 words to choose from. People who read a lot know which one is right. You can recognize it, okay? So reading, spelling comes from reading, vocabulary comes from reading, etc. All of a great deal of our literary competence. So I said, Trump's spelling mistakes reveals a deeper problem, and that is that he doesn't read. We also know that reading gives you knowledge. We also know that reading tells you that simple solutions don't work. And these are the areas in which Trump is weak. Not only does he misspell, he exhibits nearly no knowledge of current events. He has no knowledge of geography. When he was in Israel a couple of years ago, he said, it's really nice being here. When I leave here, I'm going to the Middle East, not realizing that he was there already. And simple solutions are exactly what he loves. You know, the wall, etc. His lack of knowledge of science, oh my goodness, with the virus going around, etc. So my conclusion, I wrote a short letter, and I said that Trump's failure to read is hurting all of us. They published the letter. Can you imagine? I was hoping that Trump would get angry at me and block me from Twitter, but I'll have to keep working on that. Let me go back to Benico Mason's program and an innovation which I think is really exciting. The first stage is stories. Reading is the second stage, but she inserts a substage, part of beginning and reading, which I think is really interesting. She calls it guided self-selection, self-selected reading. These are for people who've heard some stories, have some English. When they start reading, they read graded readers, easy graded readers. English, there's tons of them, you know, the Newbery series, the Longman series. She likes her students to read 1, 2, even 300 of these books before they start reading authentic books. This is a radical idea. You remember your class in school, my French class in high school. Each lesson had a unit, had a story, and the story was usually designed to emphasize the new vocabulary. And it was not too interesting, you know, Monsieur and Madame Dupont and their strange children were having breakfast and all that stuff. Never, it can't be because it's constrained by the new vocabulary. And then you go into hard classical literature. It's a big jump. Benico has inserted a giant step in the middle of easy graded readers. And this is where students do well in vocabulary growth, etc. I have been experimenting with myself. Again, I recommend this, and many of you are doing this already because you're interested in language. Home during this coronavirus stage, I've been reading, and I read in French every night, but that's easy because my French is pretty good. But Spanish, I'm not as good, as I told you. And I have a collection of graded readers. And I can read authentic Spanish. It's a little tough. I discovered Isabella Allende. Oh, my goodness. But I've been reading these easy things, and lots of them. And I found some good authors, and they're very, very good. Oh, you've got a post where to find the stories first. Thanks, Dr. Arstetti. Very good. I've been reading them every day, and I'm getting better. I give myself a test every Friday morning. Friday morning, I go to the local grocery store. And at 6 in the morning, there's a special time only for old people. You have to be 60 or older to protect you from, disease, the virus, etc. And we all wear our masks, etc. And that's when I go, and there are not too many people there, and it's safer to do that. So I do that. When I get my stuff, I check out, and I always go to the same checkout guy because I've gotten to know him. His name is Fidel. He is Mexican-American, and he speaks Spanish perfectly. But when I got to know him, I asked him to speak Spanish with me. He was a little bit reluctant, and I finally found the key. I said to him in Spanish, and I will give you my Spanish. Mi meta es hablar español como ustedes. My goal is to speak Spanish the way you do, in the plural. And that brought him around. He always speaks Spanish to me. Really nice guy. He knew that I was sincere. And I've noticed this over the months. I see him once a week now for 3-4 months. He speaks more rapidly to me now. He uses more idiomatic Spanish. He's listening to me and he's reacting in kind. I'm not getting better by practicing Spanish with him. I'm getting better by the reading, no question, but I'm certainly understanding more. It's easier to speak casual Spanish. This stuff really works. So I recommend following Dr. Mason's advice, including a period of GSSR guided self-selected reading. Now to do this, you got to have the books, folks. Dr. Mason, in her teaching at the university in Japan, had a library of 5,000 graded readers. Now we're talking. Now that takes cooperation and that kind of stuff. This is like $5 American each. This is considerable money. In fact, none of us can do this. If I want to get 100 graded readers in Spanish, it's at least $500, maybe more. And that's today's day and age, things being as tough as they are. This is quite a stretch. Fortunately, there's been an effort to put more of these things online, and I hope this will work and people will share more. So we have stage 1, which is stories. Stage 2B, beginning, stage 2A rather, self-selected reading of easy material. After that, self-selected reading of authentic material. Our job is finished when our students can read authentic material. All we need to do is stories and guided self-selected reading. Then our students are on their own. They're off and running, and access to wonderful libraries. That's the key. The goal of education in general is to make you autonomous, make you independent, so you're not dependent on teachers in school. We don't need the return business. Our goal in English as a second language and English as a first language is to bring students to the point where they can self-select their own reading and read what they want to. Now, this stage, and we're talking about what happens later, reading fiction is going to prepare them for the professions, because fiction does that. One of my favorite studies, which my colleague Jeff McQuillan came up with, he's done very good research in this area. One researcher looked at 1,000,000 words of science fiction novels that people generally read. If you read 1,000,000 words of science fiction, which is like a year's reading, you get about half of what they call academic scientific vocabulary of what you need to study serious science. So a lot of the solution to our problems in language arts and in the specialties in academic language, not drills in academic vocabulary and academic grammar, but reading fiction. So this is my talk today. Our schools are responsible only for the first two stages, only for, in language, stories, and only easy reading, and a lot of it. Hundreds of easy books. My suggestion is, if you can get access, try it on yourself. As language teachers, I know that you're all interested in improving your languages. We all hear a language, we want to speak it, etc. You can indulge. This is great fun. The problem is finding the books. The problem we're facing in the United States, and you're probably facing it too in Australia, is because of the coronavirus, which is rampant here. Libraries have closed down. Public libraries have closed down. School libraries for sure. That means there's no access of books for those who need them the most. Children of poverty. Children of poverty have few books in the home. They generally live in neighborhoods with this very few interesting reading material. In schools in high poverty areas, the libraries aren't as good. Those who need it the most have no access at all. I've been really angry at my local library, let me tell you, and I will name names, I don't care. Santa Monica. I live close to Santa Monica in California. The Santa Monica library system, I know they've got budget problems, I know all about it. They have fired half of their librarians. They've let them go. There's no one to take care of the books. There's no one to make sure they're there for easy access. The work is being done by people who volunteer with little libraries. People outside their houses have books, come take one. That's where, and it's not in every single neighborhood. This is what we need. We need librarians. They need to be supported. And we need lots of books. And don't worry if they're lost, if they're taken out. We need light reading. We need comic books that are easy, comprehensible, and very exciting. We're living now in we call the silver age of comic books, thanks to Stan Lee, the Marvel comic book company. Take a look yourself before you say this isn't right, this isn't good. Comics are the link. Children who read comics read other things too. My favorite study of comic books was called Spider-Man in the Library. They put graphic novels in a public library in an area where teenagers would gather, the young readers section. They did not allow them to circulate. You had to go to the library to read the graphic novels. The amount of time we were left there for several months. During that time, library traffic nearly doubled, and the amount of non-comic material taken up went up about 50%. Light reading, interesting reading is the answer. People writing this stuff are geniuses. Yes, I am a parent. I am a grandparent. I am still careful. I still think we need censorship, guidance. I think comic books have a little bit too much violence. I think there's a little bit too much cleavage, if you pardon the expression. That's not the fault of the genre. Thanks to Stan Lee and the Marvel comic book company, so many of the comics have absolutely gripping stories. Kids need to have access to them. They need to borrow them easily. I'm going to close by telling you one Spider-Man story. Spider-Man changed the world, one of the most important figures in literature, a superhero with problems. Well, in this one comic, this is from Peter Parker, The Amazing Spider-Man, 1985. Spider-Man, at the conclusion of his usual adventure, is trying to do a good deed. He's discovered that there's a young girl in the hospital who needs a kidney transplant. And he's decided to try to find a close relative so the transplant will stick. He does some research and finds that she has a fraternal twin brother Not quite what you want, but pretty good. Let's do the transplant. He spends time trying to find this young man. His name is Donnie, a young man in his early 20s. He finds Donnie on a building. Now, this is a comic for kids. This is amazing. And Marvel pulls it off. Donnie is on the roof and he's about to jump. Spider-Man dashes up to the roof, calls out and says, Donnie, don't jump, don't jump. Now, Donnie's too far away for Spider-Man to use his web shooters, so he has to talk him down. Donnie looks back, realizes it's Spider-Man, and he says, I'm going to jump and you can't stop me. I've got problems I just can't face. Besides, you're a superhero. What do you know about problems? And Spider-Man thinks of his problems. If you know the story, he still blames himself for the death of his uncle by not arresting a burglar who eventually killed his uncle. He has problems at work. He works for the newspaper. They keep attacking Spider-Man. He gets paid just on the basis of pictures that he takes. It's awful. The newspaper has an anti-Spider-Man stance. He says, I've got problems. Then he calls out to Donnie, and he says to Donnie, in words that will live forever in comic book literature, Donnie, you think life is easy behind this mask? You think that being a superhero means I don't have problems? Donnie, life is problems. It's problems for everyone, every day, nonstop. You know that's true. You're thinking of your problems right now. And we grow not by running away from our problems, but by facing them and trying to solve them. This is pretty heavy stuff for a comic book, I think. It's very, very well done, I think. He says, besides, Donnie, if you jump, you're killing your sister as well. And Donnie comes down from the roof. He says, okay, for my sister. And he goes to the hospital. The operation is a success. Peter Parker visits the girl in the hospital, and he's leaving the hospital, and he's thinking, the bubbles over the head. And this one worked out all right. She's going to live. But Donnie's still depressed, and there's not much I can do about it. I hope things get better for him. In other words, you can't solve everybody's problems. Not every comic is this good. My goodness, are they good. I got involved in comics in the 80s when my son had a comic book collection. And in my usual insomnia, I found his collection. I started reading Spider-Man right through in the 1980s. I was awake till dawn. They're absolutely riveting. The stories are very, very good. Check them out. Well, we do have a little bit of time for question and answer. All right. How do we do this? I ask the questions and you answer? No, that's school. No, you ask me the questions and I try to come up with solutions, and we're supposed to use the chat function. And if I can, may I have the first question, please? And you're
quite a few. So if we can just use the chat for even some of the questions that were asked before, do go ahead. There was actually a question before about videos. What about using videos?
Potential is great. I don't know of research on videos. I think movies, all these things have great potential. In terms of our definition of optimal input, I don't know if they're as rich as books. I am prepared to be convinced, though. This is a great area for research. Do kids gain from videos, from movies? And here's where I tell you how to improve your social life. Movies today are today's literature, and many of them are really first class. Let's say you're invited to a party and you're supposed to meet a friend, and your friend doesn't show up, and you go into the party and you don't know anybody, and you feel this might happen. How do you prepare for it? Here's my suggestion. Go watch the 3 latest movies. You can go up to anyone there and you can ask them, well, have you seen Spider-Man 29? What'd you think? You will eventually get into a good discussion with someone. You will get to know people easily this way. Everyone has opinions about movies, and the opinions sometimes rival the discussions in sophisticated literature classes. So movies, there's no question they're good in terms of content. In terms of language, the issue is, are they as rich as books? I really don't know. I haven't seen the research. I don't know if subtitles are all that helpful. I know subtitles work. I know you can gain from it, but you don't get that much language. Again, I don't know the research. I don't know that there's been research on this. I know it'll help. I don't know if it's as efficient as reading books. Open question. Go off, do the research. Let me know. It's the right question. Algo más.
Right. There's actually something, Stephen, that I think would probably be relevant to a lot of the, as you know, the out of hours schools, out of school hours schools, our language schools that don't teach during the day. So as I was explaining to you earlier, a lot of our people teach weekends, afternoons, you know, they give up their Sundays. And
Oh my.
so, and having a lot of new communities here in Australia, just like anywhere, I suppose, we've got languages that don't really have that much material. So what about when it comes to resources? So one of the questions here was, I mean, if we have something like a Khan, a language like a Khan, I'm just making this up, for example, and what if they don't have the kind of books that would inspire our young people? What would your suggestion be? And I'm just interpreting one of the teacher's questions here.
Very good. It's the right question. I would work toward expanding gradually, and I would first develop a library of stories on tape, stories that you can listen to, lots and lots of them, which will build literacy, and gradually start converting into books. You're never going to make the richness that we have for English or French or Spanish, etc. But that's where I would begin. That's where I would begin. Do a little more of what's helpful.
What we can do is now we've gone over time. If we can, you see the chat there, Stephen? Is there any particular question you want to address?
Well, let's see. Oh, Dr. Krashen, it says, I can't see. I don't see the chat box. It's gone. Oh, here it is. Chat. Where do we find your books? We want to go out and buy them. That's a great question. Here's the answer. I'm not writing books anymore. I haven't written books in the last 4 years. Nobody can afford them. They're too expensive. I can't even afford to buy authors' copies at authors' discounts of my own books. Not only that, I cannot afford to subscribe to journals anymore. I'm not suffering, folks. I'm in the same boat as everybody I know, okay? I'm doing better than most people, as a matter of fact, because I know the secret of wealth. I'll tell it to you in one word: inheritance. Mommy and daddy. People who don't have it are in trouble today, unless they've been very lucky. Anyway, I no longer subscribe to journals because they're too darn expensive. Journals cost hundreds of American dollars. If you see an article in a journal and you want to get a copy, you've got to pay the journal $40. And it doesn't go to the author, it goes to the journal. I've decided these people have to learn how to make an honest living. There's been a revolution in academia, those who are interested in academic literature. Began by a British specialist in algebraic geometry. My son told me about him. Wow. He is boycotting the journals and everything he publishes in what we call open access, stuff that's available for free. I started this campaign in the United States. I have a buddy who's doing it in India. He's published a big article on it in a big newspaper, The Hindu, which I just love. Everything I write and everything my colleagues write now go in what are called open access journals, free to the author, free to the reader. They're all on the internet. I know that costs money, but it's a lot less than subscribing to expensive journals. This is the way we're doing it. If you're on Twitter and you follow me on Twitter, S. Krashen, you will find I announce the new articles, not just by me, but I announce the articles by my colleagues as well. Benico Mason's stuff is right there, open access, etc. This is the wave of the future. Eventually, everything is going to be open access. More and more, I don't need the stuff in the regular journals because all the new stuff that's interesting is now coming out open access. I think we are winning the war. At the university, I recommend teachers assign articles that are open access. My books are available on my website, a lot of them, and all of my articles that are in open access. Go to my website, sdkrashen.com. D is my middle name, David, and many of my articles, some of my books, etc. More and more authors are doing this. More and more stories are finding themselves here. Oh, Nishan, thanks. I've just told you where to find things. Are they peer reviewed? Yes, absolutely. Otherwise, I won't study. I won't publish there. I want other scholars to read my work, and I read them. But it's easier to do peer reviewed this way, because here's another thing I've been doing. The articles I write are all short. You don't need to write 50-page papers. I write papers that are 3 pages and less. I write more of them, but they're easy to read. I was inspired when I discovered the most famous journal paper ever written on the double helix, the DNA breakthrough, Crick and Watson. Their paper appeared in the journal Nature, the #1 journal, not open access, but at least they wrote a short paper. It was 2 pages. That's it. No long introduction, no pieces of advice. Everything was right to the point, etc. And that's how we're doing it these days, okay? So the link you need is sdkrashen.com. You'll find my paper on why we should write short papers.
Okay. Stephen, thank you so much. We've gone just slightly over time. Can I just, again, thank you. I have to thank also the Community Languages Schools program, the New South Wales Department of Education, which does help us out in many, many ways, and the Federation of Community Language Schools, of course. Thank you, everybody, for attending. We have recorded this. We will be posting this on the YouTube channel, which is just Google New South Wales Federation of Community Language Schools, and you will be able to see the entire webinar. The chat has been also recorded, so I'll be posting the links, everything on our Google Classroom. The Google Classroom is just New South Wales Federation of Community Language School, NEX5GTR. NEX5GTR is the code. You can always email me anytime. And that's basically it. So thank you so much, Stephen. It's been great.
Great pleasure.
Best talks. You're getting applauses from here in Sydney.
Okay.
From the office. So that's it. I'll bid everybody adieu. Thank you for attending. And Stephen, yet again, an excellent presentation. Thank you so much.
Great pleasure. Thanks, you guys, for all you do, the teaching, the volunteer work. It's wonderful.
Excellent. Great. Thanks so much. Goodbye.
Okay.